is a feminist network from the MENA region. And allow me to switch in Arabic since we are launching 5 very important reports and studies around feminism in Arabic. So allow me to switch in my mother tongue. شكرا جزيلا للحضور. أنا شيرين طلعت، مديرة MENAFem Movement أو الحركة النسوية للعدالة الاقتصادية والإيكولوجية والتنمية من الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. أحدثكم من أرض المغرب الحبيب. أشكركم على الحضور. اليوم نحن سعداء لإطلاق ترجمات نسوية مع شركائنا الأساسيين Feminist Action Nexus للعدالة الاقتصادية والإيكولوجية بحضور زميلتي كيتي وزميلات أخريات. اليوم يعني بالنسبة لنا أعلم أنه يوم مهم جدا لإطلاق أدبيات نسوية باللغة العربية حول العدالة الاقتصادية والمناخية، والتي هي ليس فقط قلب نضالاتنا أو نضالنا، واسمحوا لغتي العربية الركيكة فأنا مصرية، ولكن أيضا نعتبرها بمثابة مرجعية مهمة للمدافعات والمناضلات عن الحقوق الاجتماعية والاقتصادية والمناخية من منطقة الجنوب العالمي، وخصوصا منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا. هذه الموارد التي كتبتها رفيقات وصديقات خبيرات في مجال تخصصهم. سنلتقي بالصديقة والزميلة بوميكا مشالة، وأيضا ديانا يحيى وسنام أمين. هذه التقارير نعتبرها بمثابة بوصلة ترشدنا نحو الدعوة والتحليل النسوي المشترك الجماعي، والتي توفر رؤية واضحة حول الهياكل الاقتصادية الموجودة حاليا وعلاقتها بالعدالة البيئية والمناخية وتقاطعها مع إنهاء الاستعمار والاستعمار الجديد وحقوق الإنسان. فيسعدني أن أكون معكم اليوم من MENAFem Movement و Feminist Action Nexus لإطلاق هذه التجارب، ونعد كMENAFem بالشراكة مع زملائنا Feminist Action Nexus وآخرين بأن نفعل MENAFem Hub، وهو يعني ننوي أن يكون كل شهرين أو شهر ونصف لإطلاق دراسة جديدة أو معارف جديدة نسوية مهتمة بالعدالة الإيكولوجية والاقتصادية، والتي هي قلب نضالنا في MENAFem نحو مجهود جماعي لتغيير هذا النظام العالمي الغير عادل إلى نظام أخضر نسوي. وشكرا، في انتظار العروض والنقاش. And over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and welcome also everyone from my side. I'm Katie Tobin. I work at WEDO, which stands for the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and we spearhead the Feminist Action Nexus for Economic and Climate Justice that Shireen was mentioning. And we're really, really thrilled to be partnering with MENAFem Movement and to be here with all of you today and to be able to share these incredible feminist resources in Arabic at the suggestion of Shireen. So thank you so much, Shireen. The Feminist Action Nexus began in 2021, bringing together feminists working on economic justice and feminists working on climate justice. And of course, the growing ranks of those of us working on both, because we thought it would be really important to put forward systemic analysis, as Shireen was saying, that the root causes of climate injustice, of gender inequality, of economic injustice and poverty are shared. And they lie in neocolonialism, in white supremacy, in unjust structures that govern how our global finances and economic system works. The sort of extractivism of labor, especially women's labor, and of the environment is all kind of tied to the same thing. So we published in 2021 3 really important pieces that we call our conceptual framework, and that ground everything else that we do as the Action Nexus. One was our blueprint for feminist economic justice, written by Diana Yahaya. So Diana will share that with you in a minute. The next one was Bhumika Muchala's brief on a feminist decolonial global Green New Deal. So we'll also have a video from Bhumika going over the concepts there. And we've moved away a little bit from this Green New Deal label, primarily because of the sort of co-optation and the way that the Green New Deal conversation has evolved, especially in Europe. So what we're putting forward is really, what is a decolonial, feminist, non-extractivist paradigm look like that could benefit both people and the planet? And then we also have a slightly shorter piece on human rights in the private sector by Sanam Amin. And unfortunately, Sanam, I don't think is able to be with us here today, but that's our sort of conceptual framework. And then from there, we distilled the kind of main recommendations in those 3 pieces into what we call our key demands. And those we published in 2022. And so that's another piece we're really excited to be able to share today in Arabic. And then the 5th piece is our kind of flagship report as the Action Nexus, which we're calling our Trends Report, which says, okay, we have our 7 key demands: debt justice, tax justice, trade justice, ending corporate capture, gender just climate finance, democratizing global economic governance, and then an overarching transforming systems. But we know that the world we live in is very far away from the world we're advocating for and the world that we're demanding in those 7 areas. So the Trends Report looks at how far we are from those demands or from achieving them, and where there are local sites of struggle and global advocacy efforts to advance those demands and to change things for the better. So we'll talk more about that in a little while, but those are the 5 pieces that we are sharing today. We're going to put all of them in the chat in a moment. I see that question. Absolutely. We're thrilled to be able to finally share them. I see that we have with us Elham Idarus, who is one of our incredible interpreters. These are lengthy, complicated 30-page reports with graphs, with charts. So Elham, shukran, thank you so much for all of your work. We really feel blessed to have a feminist activist as a translator for us as well. So I think I'll let Diana and Bhumika's presentations explain a little bit more about the Action Nexus. We'll also put the website in the chat, because I really want us also, the point of today is to hear from you, to have some really good discussion about how you might use these resources, how you see them in kind of conversation with your own work and with the sort of regional realities. So let me share Diana's video first. I was having some issues with the screen share, so I'm sorry that it kept going to my desktop background. I don't know why. So just give me 1 sec. Here's Diana's video. Let me share. And please put in the chat if you have any trouble hearing or seeing, or seeing the video. Thanks. So over to virtual Diana, and then we have real Diana with us for the discussion.
About its link to climate change. All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today with all of you, and also equally excited to be talking you through and taking you through basically the Action Nexus blueprint of the feminist economic agenda, and then also to be hearing from Melania later on about its link to climate change. What I'll be basically doing this evening is to start off by taking you through some of the issues and feminist analysis around the criticisms of the current economic systems, as well as economic policies, as well as how all of the different rules that are being made in all of these spaces of global governance for economic rules have a very particular as well as significant impact on women. And then I'll also be taking you through some of the principles and recommendations from the Action Nexus, which we are hoping and asking all of you to join us in advocating and calling for, so that we can actually see and achieve that feminist economic vision of the future, and an economic system that is for the people and the planet, and not for the elite, select few, as well as for profit. So to start off, I find that the word economics, or the field of economic, has always been very fascinating when you consider its origin. So the word economic actually originated from a Greek word, which is oikonomia. I might not be pronouncing this correctly, which actually meant household management. And when you consider that that word came from the word household management, you can imagine how central the idea of what takes place within a home or a house, the labor, the work, that happens there is within what was then the entire economic system. And then you consider as well that back then that word oikonomia, or the word economic in its origin several centuries ago, also serves its purpose when it actually meant the welfare of people. That was the other element of that word definition. And then you consider how economic as a domain, as a field, as a set of rules and policies, and how they are actually being made in today's world. Because if you fast forward now and you consider from that origin of the word of household management, and then you take it to today, and then you have a field that is making rules and policies that have an implication and an impact on almost every aspect of all our lives, because that's what today's economics are like. Whether you create those rules at a micro level, at a meso level, or even at a macro level, all of these rules have a very particular significant impact on women, on the poor, on other marginalized identity, especially from the global south. Because if you consider, for example, how economics affects the prices of goods, and how the prices of goods goes up and down, and how that's ingrained and tied into all of the trade policies that determine those flows of goods. How economic also impact our accessibility or even unavailability of public services, whether it's your water, your health, your electricity, your internet, and so forth. And all of that has to do with whether governments are, have the necessary resource, because they are able to mobilize them through tax rules to actually fund those services, or if they are having debt, and as a result of those debt are having to cut those public services. You also have, economic impacting on our most basic access to medicines or to technology, because you have intellectual property rules being made in the trade domain that dictates what gets shared and what does not get shared. And that has impacted, as we have clearly seen with the recent COVID vaccine patent, where it's literally one single trade rule that is refusing so many countries in the global south access to patents and know-hows and technology. And so that's a very, very specific impact. And then you also have, taxes, where we pay taxes. How many of us pay taxes in almost every basic items or goods that we consume or that we use? Whether it's your basic staple food, whether it's your rice, your wheat, your bread, or your sanitary pad, or any other basic items that you need, how much taxes do you pay for that? And then when you consider how much taxes is being paid by large multinational corporations, as well as the many wealthy elites in many parts of the world. And then if you consider governments actually have money to put into women's rights organizations, into safe houses, into other government entity or organization that are really important for ensuring women's rights as well as gender equality. And if that's not happening because governments are basically being undermined by their resource mobilization or the debt and austerity policies. And so we can see how all of these economic policies really have a very particular impact on women. And you see also that many of these policies are being made without women. They're being made without women, they're being made without the majority of the world's population, they're being made basically in the halls of many of the global north countries, whether it's Washington or New York or Vienna or Brussels, and it's being made in the presence of many of the rich wealthy elites as well as large multinational corporations who have so much influence and power over the decision making in many of our global governance spaces, including economic governance, through all of this principle of multi-stakeholderism as well as public-private partnerships. And we have also a set of economic rules that has been for the last several decades or so really been on the basis of like one particular economic order, and that is the neoliberal economic order. And those neoliberal economic order around deregulation, privatization, as well as liberalization, all are intertwined and interlinked to a lot of these different economic policies that I was mentioning to you earlier. Which then takes me to what are some of the policies, principles, as well as recommendations that we are all asking as a feminist collective and that we see is necessary in order for us to remedy a lot of the issues that we've mentioned earlier. So as I mentioned, that whole idea of the neoliberal economic policies is about growth and it's about extractivists. And so any kind of economic or work that is not, or labor or care that is not considered productive doesn't really count within this current economic system. And so we really need a shift from an economic system that only counts things when you produce something literally, not even metaphorically, into one that is really, really acknowledging all of the different care works that women do at home, and then all of the other work that is also valuable for people's welfare, for the planet, but might not necessarily be extracting or producing something material. And that can be through a couple of recommendations, such as ending austerity, as well as ensuring commitments to public services, as well as social protections, shifting from that whole idea of degrowth, which is basically currently the goal of many economics policies, as well as government when they talk about economy, is that they need to grow. How much is our GDP growing? And so really shifting from that to a care-based economy. And then also breaking down and diversifying the current supply chain, which, as we saw when COVID happened, and even as we speak right now with the war in Ukraine, has completely dismantled and disintegrated like the moment a particular crisis takes place. And so really diversifying that and ensuring that countries also have the sovereignty to ensure their own local value chain is really important as well, to shift from that idea of being productive into a feminist decolonial green new economy. The second principle is really around having an economy that restores the primacy of human rights and well-being over the planet. As I mentioned, the ultimate goal of most of the economic systems, model and policy today, and of governments who are implementing them, is really growth and GDP. And even when you consider these numbers around GDP and growth, they are also actually ultimately made up. There's no actual rationale about what kind of GDP growth is a good enough growth and what is not a good enough growth. And so restoring that can mean also by introducing a lot of ex-ante and periodic human rights impact assessments of all economic policies, trade and investment agreement, which are happening now to a degree, but in many cases, when they do happen, governments tend to ignore those human rights impact assessments, and then in many other cases, they don't even actually take place. So this is one of the ways that we can restore back that primacy of human rights. Thirdly, is that we want an economy that promotes equitable and global trade order. As I was mentioning earlier, we have, for example, corporations with such large disproportionate amount of power over the decision making and of our global economic system, and much of that stems from the current investor protection system, which is found in a lot of trade agreements and also in a lot of other trade agreements as well. And so dismantling that investor protection system, or investor state dispute settlement, is, as they are what often known in a lot of trade agreements, is one step towards that, as well as I was mentioning earlier, the existing intellectual property system, which has really denied equitable sharing and access to a lot of countries, to a lot of populations of technology, which have been controlled and monopolized and patented by large multinational corporations. We also want an economy that redistributes wealth and resources, and this is where the question around tax and a just and equitable global tax architecture and system is really, really important. And the last two principles around, firstly, an economy that promotes debt justice, as well as new structure of sovereign debt. As I was mentioning, debt has a particular implication when it translates, especially into a lot of austerity measures and packages in a lot of countries. And a lot of countries, especially in the global south, are facing a debt crisis. And so we really do need a new multilateral and legal framework for those debt cancellation, as well as workout mechanism, and then an unconditional cancellation of all public external debt payments by all lenders. And the final set of principles and recommendation is really around the global economic governance architecture itself and how undemocratic it is and how we need it to become much more democratic. And we see that through by, number one, limiting all of the powers that corporations and private sector currently have within the economic global governance system, as well as restoring all of that decision-making around macroeconomic policies, which has traditionally been the domain of like institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Funds, and the World Trade Organization, or even other elite or like cluster of group of countries such as the G20, as well as the OECD, back to much more democratic domains such as the UN. And while that domain is, of course, the UN is not without its own flaws as well, it is certainly a much more democratic space than many of the ones that was previously mentioned, including many of the newly emerging and long-standing issues and areas such as tax, AI, internet governance, and so forth, which is increasingly now being put in these other economic bodies that do not actually take people as well as the planet into account. So these are just some of the principles and recommendations. It is, as I think a lot of my colleagues were mentioning earlier, building on the work that a lot of feminist movement and social movements have really been putting out and have really been advocate and are really like set of principles as well as recommendations that we're really calling upon everyone to take up so that we can really pursue that feminist future that we're all here to try and achieve. Thank you.
So thank you so much to 2 years ago, Diana. I think I'm handing over to Majda now for some reflection.
Hello everyone. معكم ماجدة العجمي. أنا المكلفة بالتواصل والمكلفة بالتواصل والأدفوكسي لمينافem Movement. سعيدة لتواجدي معكم هنا. شكرا لك كات وشيرين. الآن يسعدني أن أقدم فيديو الخاص ببوميكا مشالة التي يعد عملها جزء لا يتجزأ من فهمنا لا يتجزأ من فهمنا للتقاطع بين الحركة النسوية وإنهاء الاستعمار والعدالة البيئية من خلال ورقتها حول الاتفاق الأخضر العالمي الجديد النسوي لإنهاء الاستعمار. تلقي بوميكا الضوء على روابط الحاسمة بين هذه المفاهيم وتأثيرها المحتمل على أطر السياسات، وبينما نسعى جاهدين لإحداث تغيير ملموس في هذه المجالات فإن أفكارها ستساعدنا في ذلك. والآن دعونا نشاهد أو نرى مشاركة بوميكا لخبرتها ورؤيتها معنا لكي نعرف كيف يمكن دمج هذه المفاهيم في أطر السياسات من أجل إحداث تغيير ملموس.
أسفة على المقاطعة، أؤكد على وجود ترجمة إلى اللغة العربية ستجدونها أسفل الشاشة ولكن تحت اللغة اليابانية. ولكنها اللغة العربية. شكرا مجد على المشاركة و over to you.
You know, I'm really in great appreciation for this opportunity to participate in such a critical and exciting conversation today. So I've been thinking around since about April 2019 about, you know, what would a global Green New Deal look like? And what would make it feminist? What would make it decolonial? What would be the paradigm shifts, the key principles? And at the very heart of it, what is the systemic transformation needed? So I'll start by just laying out that the way I've been formulating the notion of a global Green New Deal is by weaving together three distinct threads. They are, first and foremost, global justice in the deeply unequal global economic order. And this centers climate reparations as well as structural policy reforms in an intertwined manner, in an intersectional manner, so that when we talk about global financial trade and investment, we talk about economic policy, particularly debt justice and tax justice, the call for debt restructuring mechanism and a UN global tax body. It is also intertwined with reparations and the long history of ecological colonization, and the fact that climate is not just an environmental crisis, it's a crisis created by fossil capitalism. It's a crisis created by the colonial powers, and it is not at all a universal crisis. It is going to be the most unequal crisis in the ways in which racialized and gendered regions and bodies and communities are going to be disproportionately impacted. So we see the intersections more clearly than ever now, that climate reparations, colonial reparations, and structural policy reforms are intertwined. They cannot be separated. So decoloniality is the appreciation that we may have, the colonies may have been politically independent since the post-World War II years, but the structures of the economy, the structures of society, and the relations by which we are organized are very much and even increasingly shaped by colonial logics. So let me just start with looking at what do we mean by global justice. So it's a huge thing to say global justice, but in the framework of a global Green New Deal, we would center that structural policy change toward justice and equity has to acknowledge ecological colonization that then was followed directly by fossil fuel capitalism. So when we say ecological colonization, which amazingly was included in the latest IPCC report, you know, what do we mean? So we mean the disproportionate use by former colonizer countries of the ecology of former colonies without payment, restitution, and recognition. We mean the violation of local populations' right to their own ecological resources and sovereignty, both past to present. So ecological colonization is set, you know, in the centuries that went before the rise of fossil fuels, which is around the, you know, early 1800s, around, they say, 1829, 1830. And ecological colonization is really about how raw materials and commodities were extracted and then exported for great profit from the colonies that built the wealth of the colonizers and laid the foundation for industrialization at the expense of the rights, sovereignty, wealth, and climate of the colonies. Why is this important today? Because not only did ecological colonization make the global South and former colonies so much more vulnerable to climate change today in terms of environmental disfigurement, in terms of the crop diversity hollowed out for cash crops, but because it set the pattern for today's unequal division of labor and trade exchanges. It set the pattern for the fact that today the global south is still producing the primary commodities and raw materials by and large for fueling the consumption, the overconsumption of the north. And it is then also important to understand climate debt, that the carbon emissions from these long histories were very much due to the colonial practices. So when we say that developed countries are responsible for well over 60% of historical emissions, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about fossil fuels, but also a long history of ecological colonization. And that then leads to the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities, which you're aware that today CBDR is being attacked in so many international negotiations and forums. And so it is an imperative to fight for CBDR and to demand in our advocacy that differentiated historical responsibilities in addressing the climate crisis must be protected. It must be upheld. It cannot be eroded or foregone for the kind of rationales that many developed countries are giving, that a tiny amount of middle income countries have the necessary financial resources. This is not a sensible ground on which to attack common but differentiated responsibilities. So CBDR is actually already a real principle established in 1992 and is the groundwork for a reparations approach that recognizes that differentiated responsibilities means a differentiated scale of action. Climate reparations then also centers two key aspects: genuine decarbonization to end fossil fuels, as well as just and adequate financing that meets the real price of loss and damage and adaptation through adequate, predictable, and accessible grant, not loan, not debt-creating financing, grant financing. Not only have developed countries failed to realize the Green Climate Fund's $100 billion a year by 2020 goal, long already passed and far insufficient and inadequate, but there needs to be a recognition that 100 billion is merely a floor, and actual climate finance requirements assessed by the UN are between $1 to $2 trillion per year. Rich countries say this scale of finance can only be met through the private sector. So this means financial leveraging, blended finance, de-risking, which we've all seen how they have really been amplified in the private turn or the private first agenda that the UN has also now embraced. Meanwhile, there is little to none political will today to use public financial instruments. And let's just stop and recall that, let's just stop and assess that public financial instruments is the main mechanism by which central banks of the richest countries over the last 2 years generated a staggering 25 trillion to respond to COVID. We see that public financial instruments are responding to war in record time. So these rationales given that there is no public financing for an emergency as critical as climate change, a war that is affecting the globe, really hold no ground. It holds absolutely no ground. It has to be public financial instruments. And so when we look at the fact that so the vast majority of public resources of the poorest countries are going to debt repayments, and we see the history of ecological colonization, then the case for reparations is very much centered also on debt justice. So again, we're making the case that a kind of reparations approach on Global Green New Deal means that a Global Green New Deal is about structural policy transformation. It's about the mechanisms for debt justice, the turn towards decarbonization, around adequate financing. So it's around these civil society demands, these movement demands that we've long been making. And we then connect debt also to the fact that the repayment of debt and the debt crises is then overlaid by structural adjustment conditionalities, which are actually coming back today, enforcing privatization, public spending cuts, deregulation of labor, deregulation of environment regulations, trade liberalization, public-private partnership, global tax competition, and imposition of intellectual property rights. And one of the key things we've been seeing in many IMF loans is how opening contracts for natural resource extraction is being written into a lot of the financial bailout loans. So we see that climate change is being exacerbated in all kinds of secret ways, not just in the kind of big business deals and extractive mining and forest logging projects that we hear about, but also in these shadowy unknown contracts where the debt crisis is being used as a way in which to create even further liberalization and foreign contracts and bidding of natural resources, as well as privatization of land, of forest, of natural resource ecosystem. So let's take a step back here, which I think is necessary for a global Green New Deal approach, right? The international financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF, they were designed at a 1944 conference in Bretton Woods in the United States in the World War II era, with absolutely very little representation for any of the colonies. This is pre-political independence for most of the world. And it produced a system that today still is operating in the same manner of economic apartheid, of economic and political exclusion and imposition from past to present. They facilitate the ways in which the international economic and financial system was designed in ways that actually foreclose the possibility of economic decolonization. These institutions ensured that political decolonization would be separated from economic decolonization. So we look back and we see that no wonder the global economy today continues to bear a striking resemblance to the structures and patterns carved out by ecological colonization, as well as the economic plunder that colonization entrenched. I just want to conclude with also highlighting the feminist approach, that when we talk about a structural feminist lens, we are looking at gender as a system structuring power relations, not just gender as woman. We're talking about the sexual global division of labor, the care economy that upholds a wage economy to the greatest historical subsidy, 13 trillion. We're talking about how the unpaid care work has essentially held up all of the human care and services during the pandemic. We're talking about a systemic change towards really centering women and girls in economic policy. And this means a long-term scaling up of public services and social protection. It also means divesting and investing. The divestment frameworks also have to be centered around the divestment from the military, especially the US military, and investing into women and girls, divesting from fossil fuels, where rich country private banks just in 2020 during the pandemic loaned $2.7 trillion to fossil fuel companies between 2015 to 2020. And this is about the Paris Climate Agreement time to 2020. And to also mention that gendered austerity is really also about how women are repaying the debt of the nations through their bodies, through the labor that is imprinted on their bodies, mental, emotional, spiritual, psychological, medical. The well-being of women is the expense of repaying the nation's debt. And in this way, we see that women not only subsidize, but also are through their labor, their unpaid as well as their paid labor, their care as well as their exploitation, are compensating for the public services that the state is failing to provide. So a decolonial approach is really about centering the feminist, centering the colonial history, questioning the kind of economic theories that we have been taught and that we are unconsciously absorbing and following. And it is about looking clearly at how the colonial hierarchies of racism, of sexism, of heterosexuality, of a separation between nature and human, these constructs have to be dismantled. These contracts have to be slowly and collectively, absolutely dismantled in order for a global Green New Deal to occur. So a long, big call, but I think if not now, then never. And I think social movements and people around the world are more than ready for an intersectional and bold approach. The colonizers had a very ambitious vision, and we can match it. Thank you.
شكرا بوميكا لمشاركة هذه المعلومات القيمة. والآن دعونا نتعمق في نتائج تقرير The Critical Trends Report الاتجاهات الحديثة، والذي يهدف إلى تقييم التقدم نحو العدالة النسوية الاقتصادية والمناخية في ظل التحديات الأخيرة مثل جائحة كوفيد. ما هي سنتعرف على ما هي أهم النتائج التي توصل إليها هذا التقرير. لك الكلمة كاتي. للتذكير فقط بالنسبة للناس، بالنسبة للأشخاص الذين جاءوا قبل قليل، الترجمة موجودة، فقط يمكنك الضغط على تحت في it's referred، يعني يمكنك الضغط لتحت على الجابونيز وستجد ترجمة للعربية. شكرا.
Thanks so much, Majda, and thanks also to Bhumika and to Diana for allowing us to screen those presentations. I'm going to go over very briefly our most recent report, and then we will open up into discussion, including with Bhumika and Diana. So that's kind of the most exciting part of the session, so I won't delay us too much. But as a sort of final resource we wanted to share with you, the Action Nexus just published our Critical Trends Report towards Economic and Climate Justice. And as I mentioned before, this is really looking at, okay, we've got this incredible vision for a feminist, decolonial, just economy that we were sort of gleaning from Bhumika's work, from Diana's work, from Sanam's piece, which we'll also share in the chat. And then, of course, as both of them have mentioned, from the massive body of feminist structural analysis that precedes us. But we need to look at sort of where we are in relation to those goals. So sorry if you can hear my sad child in the background. So there's one chapter for each of the key demands, and the overarching demand is transforming systems for feminist economic and climate justice. And the report has a kind of snapshot of trends and of key statistics for each chapter. So for this one, I'll show the graph in English and then I'll show it in Arabic right after. So it didn't work to show them both on the screen. It was too messy, but one of the kind of main trends that we found, and we worked with an amazing feminist consulting firm to help us with this research, was really comparing, if you look at the big picture, the measly, paltry amounts of official development assistance that rich countries are providing with what they're spending on fossil fuels, what they're spending on the U.S., what the U.S. military spends alone, as Bhumika mentioned, which has incredible repercussions, not only for global conflict and militarization and policing, but also for ecological destruction. And then, everyone was sort of excited about this new allocation of special drawing rights in the context of the pandemic. But as you see, while significant, it doesn't stack up at all to these sort of broader amounts of spending on both militarization and fossil fuels. So on exactly the opposite of the things that would care for people and planet. So here's the same chart in Arabic, and this is in the Arabic Trends report, and we'll also share these slides afterwards. And then on the chapter on debt, so as I mentioned, the report is like 35 pages long. This is just a really quick sneak peek of what's in it. One of the more depressing findings of the report was looking at what happened really recently. So we know that the debt crisis has colonial roots, that most of this debt is entirely illegitimate and displacing the burden onto ordinary people of a neo-colonial economic system. But what the report shows is that it's actually getting exponentially worse over the past few years. And this graph is really interesting because it shows that in 2020, every region of the world spent more on debt than on healthcare. And then the graphs show you the comparison. But this wasn't the case as recently as 2016. So even in the last decade, the debt situation has gotten remarkably worse, with incredible implications, as we know, and as we heard from Diana and Bhumika, for women and feminized people, for the people whose paid and unpaid labor is relied upon to pick up the slack. Then in terms of taxation, this is where there is a glimmer of hope this year, as we saw with the African group's successful introduction of a resolution in the General Assembly to actually start the process of having a UN Framework Convention on Tax, which has been, as we know, a longstanding demand of the tax justice movement for decades, and is finally happening, despite resistance of OECD and Global North countries, which is a real opportunity for us as kind of global civil society to emphasize the role of the UN as the true democratic multilateral arena that should be making global decisions around economic issues such as tax, and also to make sure that we are infusing that convention process with climate analysis and feminist analysis, so that if this is our one shot these days to really transform the international taxation architecture, we better make sure that it responds to the whole breadth of our current reality. So another chart that just shows that if you think about, okay, countries are spending, as we saw in the previous chart, so much money servicing their debt, and then they're losing so much money to cross-border tax abuse, to the unfair, often legal, but illegitimate ways that tax systems are set up to allow external multinational corporations to extract profit and not allow the governments to actually enough of that revenue to be able to then spend it on public services. In terms of global economic governance, this is another really tricky one, as we heard in the presentations previously, that the colonial setup of the World Bank and the IMF means that until the sort of quota system is transformed, the US has a veto, and the governments making decisions are able to subject the rest of the world basically to an incredibly unfair economic order. And we saw this even, of course, in the context of COVID-19, where the IMF really did attempt to ramp up its lending, but it was kind of, give with one hand, take with the other, because those COVID-19 loans trapped governments into additional austerity measures. So they had to sign on to ways of curbing their spending, even as they were receiving funds that in turn contributed to their debt burden. So we saw that in 90 of the 107 loans that the IMF prescribed during COVID-19 and the height of the pandemic. In terms of trade, and this is where we really relied on the expertise of Diana, so thank you again, Diana, for that. One of the things we're really going to be focusing on a lot this year is the kind of new green extractivism, and how, as we transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to one more centered on renewable energy, if we don't change the overarching system, what we will end up doing is replacing extraction of fossil fuels with extraction of minerals from lands that are that belong to indigenous peoples, huge amounts of land grabbing on the African continent, et cetera, and that will without that kind of structural transformation, will continue to entrap the global south in this kind of resource extraction model. So that's something that we're really looking at, given that as the sort of green economy progresses, we're looking at a 500% projected growth in demand for those minerals. Corporate capture, this is a big one that we see around the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change annual meeting, the COP. Increasing amounts of fossil fuel companies present there and lobbyists registered, even in the past 3 years, which is what this graph shows. It shows that in 2021, there were already too many. In 2022, there were even more than that. And then this past year, 2023, 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists were at the meeting where we should be figuring out how to move away from fossil fuels. So this is from Kick Big Polluters Out. It's really valuable and terrifying research that they've done. And then finally, climate finance. So one of the things that Action Nexus does is really look at the kind of bigger picture of the demands around financing for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage, which is the current kind of one of the frontiers of this fight, as part of this broader system of, what are the ways that the economic system that we live in needs to change to enable climate finance. Like, it doesn't make sense to be talking about a few $100 million over here without transforming the overall system. And this year, the UNFCCC will finalize its deliberations around a new collective quantified goal, so a new kind of annual goal to replace the 100 billion per year by 2020 that was set out in the Paris Agreement, which, as we know, it's not like that was even achieved, but the scale is so much higher than that. So it looks like we're actually talking about 5.8 trillion per year, or until 2030, that the global south needs for climate, to finance climate action. So that's why we need to look at the IMF, the World Bank, global taxation, debt, because there's a lot of money that's going to be required. So we have to figure out how we transform the system in order to get it. So I think I will stop there and hand over to Shireen so that we can discuss the significance of all of this. And yeah, very, again, pleased to be here with all of you. So thank you so much, and over to you, Shireen.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks for all our wonderful sisters and speakers today, and of course for all feminists who are attending and bearing the time with us. I will switch again to Arabic. شكرا كيتي، وشكرا للزميلات والرفيقات النسويات على العروض المهمة، وأيضا للنسويات الحضور معنا اليوم. كما يعني تم ذكر العديد من التحديات وأيضا الاتجاهات، العدسة النسوية في التعامل مع النظام العالمي، بنيوية النظام العالمي. ولن أغفل ولا يجب أن نغفل جميعا أيضا التحدي الأكبر والذي نواجهه الآن، وهي المذبحة في غزة، والتي هي مستمرة إلى اليوم، والتي نراها نحن في MENAFem كتحدي آخر، بل أكبر التحديات أقدر أقول يعني فالنظام العالمي أدار لنا وجهه الحقيقي بالنسبة وليس فقط لغزة وأهل فلسطين، وليس فقط لنا في الشرق الأوسط شمال أفريقيا، ولكن لكل دول الجنوب العالمي. نحن نتحدث اليوم عن قضايا مهمة ومؤثرة، وأيضا تكاد تكون ليس فقط يومية وحياتية، ولكن مفصلية في حياة الشعوب. قضايا تمويل المناخ، قضايا الديون، قضايا الخاصة بالسياسات التقشفية إلى آخره. ونسعى إلى تغيير ليس فقط ريفورم، وليس فقط governance حوكمة، ولكن تغيير شامل لهذا النظام الاقتصادي الغير عادل إلى نظام أخضر نصفي. فكل ما تم عرضه اليوم بالإضافة إلى ما أشرت إليه يحتاج منا النظرة نصفية عميقة حتى تسنى لنا إيجاد ليس فقط حلول. أنا لا أريد حلول أو تبريرات لهذا النظام، ولكن فرص العمل سويا بشكل جمعي نحو هذا التغيير الشامل لهذا النظام الظالم الغير عادل، والذي منذ نشأته قائم على سياسات نيوليبرالية، قائم على سياسات، قائم على ثروات يعني اقتنسها ولا استولى عليها الاستعمار من مواردنا الأساسية، والتي الآن يصدرها لنا في صورة ديون، والتي ليس فقط نغرق تحتها، ولكن أيضا يستخدمها كسلاح ضد دولنا، ضد دول الجنوب العالمي. أنا سأفتح باب النقاش معنا حضوريا بقى وليس فيديو بوميكا وأيضا ديانا، وأحب أنوه أنه يوجد ترجمة. There is translation to English again. There's translation to English. Please switch if you're still struggling with. ويوجد ترجمة إلى العربية، فمتحدثة الزميلات المتحدثات سيتدخلون بالإنجليزية. ولكن أريد فتح باب النقاش من الحضور أيضا. أرجو الكتابة في الشات أو يعني الأسئلة الخاصة أو الاقتراحات إلى آخره. فقط دعوني أوجه سؤال إلى المتحدثات حول رؤيتهم لسبل التضامن والترافع المشتركة جميعا من الحركة العالمية، النسوية العالمية، أو بالأخص في الجنوب العالمي، وما هي الفرص والتحديات. سأبدأ بالزميلة ديانا ثم أنتقل إلى الزميلة بوميكا. ديانا, I hope that the translation got the question and the floor is yours.
Hi, Shireen. Yes, I am with all of you, and I'm very, very happy to be with all of you this evening, even though it's quite late in where I am at. I'm still very, very pleased and happy to be here and to see this report being launched in a language that usually you don't find other reports and other resources getting translated into. So I'm really, really thrilled about that, and that's why I'm here. So I think that question that Shireen have asked was a really tough one, especially when we think about within the current global context. And I think it's been a thing that has been said for quite a while of how multilateralism has been in crisis. And I think nothing is such an exemplary example of how much in crisis or on the verge of breakdown, or perhaps we can even say broken down, multilateralism actually is than the current multilateral response or any kind of multilateral efforts that we can see over the genocide that's currently happening in Palestine. you really see, I think, in so many of these different multilateral spaces where even when you have the majority of the world, or 153 states in the world, having a particular position on the genocide in Palestine, and all it takes is one or two extremely powerful states in the global north, the US, EU, we know who they all are, to undermine everything else that you could potentially achieve within the multilateral system. And I think that's really currently being seen with the genocide in Palestine, with what's happening within the International Court of Justice, with what's happening within the United Nations. It's also something that we can see and we can anticipate will come up as we have as feminist movement. The Commission on the Status of Women is coming up in a couple of weeks' time. And obviously that's also going to be a space where you'll have state basically trying to bargain, between ending the genocide in Palestine with other women's rights issue in these multilateral spaces. But then having said that, I think I do recall and I echoes what Bhumika's point was in her video recording, which I think is still valid and is still valuable and is still useful, even though we recorded that video, I can't remember how, quite some time ago, in that there is so much power within the movement, within solidarity between people, between activists, between feminist movement, especially those of us in the global south. But I think this is also a moment in time where that solidarity is demanded and is expected and needs to be seen more coming from movements in the global north as well, as the movement that have to hold their government, who are powerful, who are in many cases setting the scene for a lot of these things, to account based on what we, the movement in the global south, are asking for and are demanding. And I think as those who have worked within the economic justice sphere, or for myself personally, as someone who has done a lot of work around trade, and having seen all of these different examples where when movement really come together, there are some gains that we are able to make. If we look at some of the past example of the World Trade Organization, that I do still believe that therein lies where the possibility for change, both systemic and structural, and many of which that we are calling for within this report. But I think really emphasizing that solidarity from the global north, from different movements, is really, really important. And I think this space is one of the example of spaces for someone who's from another region as well, and to be able to be here and have this in conversation with all of you about how we see those kind of systemic and structural change.
Thanks a lot, Diana, for putting this out. And I believe that we need to have more in-depth around the WTO and the trade policies. There, for the information of the audience, there's the 13th ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization in Abu Dhabi next week. MENAFem will be presented there to try to raise the voice from the region, from the movement, and hope to hear more from in the chat or from the attendees about it. And I know our colleagues also at the Gender Action Nexus are involved in formalizing a working group around trade. So hopefully at MENAFem Hub week with Gender Action Nexus, we can have a more in-depth discussion on trade. And now, Bhumika, over to you, political solidarity. And what can get us together from the global movement, especially from the Global South movement, and what is your vision on that? Thank you. Over to you, Bhumika.
Hi, hello, thanks. I hope you can see me. This was very interesting. The recording was from, I think it was from almost 2.5, maybe more years ago. It was from 2021. And while it was quite painful to listen to myself, you know, it's hard to watch videos of yourself, but it's shocking to me that how much is still very, very much relevant. Yeah, 3 years from then, not much has changed. In fact, we see things getting even worse in the question of military imperialism, with the colonial genocide and war in Gaza and Palestine is more clear, more shocking, more visceral than ever before. So it's quite sad feeling to see how much is getting worse, how everything still stands. In terms of feminist solidarity, I think the main point I've always felt, and I think many iterate the same sort of vision, is that we need to transcend across all our dividing lines. We need to cross the boundaries and the borders of our different themes. So whether we are focusing on land and agriculture, whether we're focusing on health and education, whether we're focusing on the financial issues or climate change, we need to cross all the division points and really come together in a solid, unified narrative and analysis. Our narratives also need to shift and dismantle the existing neoclassical, neoliberal narratives. We need to dismantle many of the terms that we use, such as reclaiming what we mean by development, reclaiming what we mean by rights, because we use the same language as the colonial system. So it's imperative on us to redefine, you know, what we mean by these very same terms. When I say that I think the idea of crossing the dividing lines and working together or transcending the divisions, it's not that we don't have key differences in approach, in the institutional focus, in the objectives, in the strategies. Of course, somebody campaigning on health and education will have very different strategies and needs and requirements than somebody working on climate change. The point is that for all these various groups and networks and advocacy initiatives to have a joint unified narrative around the structural drivers of our inequality and exploitation, to have a more structuralist analysis of the key dilemma of neoliberal extraction and accumulation and exploitation, or we can say economic colonialism. One such narrative that I would like to offer today is perhaps a narrative of delinking. Delinking in the sense of the global South proactively separating and delinking from the ways in which it is dependent and entangled in the structures and networks of the global North, such as the production sector oriented towards cash crops and exports, such as the land and resources today being embroiled in climate colonialism. How do we come together in a sense of solidarity for the just transition through a kind of decolonizing delinking, to delink in order to decolonize? And this fits in very well with reparations. So perhaps a unifying narrative around these sorts of structural and overarching principles and demands.
Thanks a lot, Bhumika, and very important term, hopefully not only term, but political actions and political movement around delinking. And I mean, in this critical moment that we are facing in the world, I only see this. I only see political approach as a salvation to this crisis, and I believe that anti-colonial, decolonial, delinking is the suitable approach that maybe we need to work more hard on that. Either the global movement the governments and to transform this structure. والنقاش مفتوح وباب النقاش مفتوح، وإذا كان هناك أسئلة أو تعليقات من الحضور أرجو أن تتفضلوا بالتعليق. وأيضا أؤكد على وجود الدراسات وإتاحتها موجودة على الويب سايت لجندر أكشن نكسس، وقد تم تداولها هنا أيضا، موجودة على ويب سايت MENAFem Movement. ونحن أيضا يعني في انتظار اقتراحات أخرى من نسويات منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا، من منطقة مشرق مغرب أيضا، في المواضيع التي تريدون أن نفتحها أو نتعمق في دراستها أو ننتج أو نساعد في إنتاج أدبيات عنها، لأنه أمر مهم في مجال العدالة الاقتصادية والإيكولوجية، أيضا بشراكة مع زميلاتنا في Gender Action Nexus. إذن عندي سؤال آخر للحضور، وأيضا كيتي وماجدة. سأخذ إلهام ثم أطرح سؤالي. إلهام عيدروس، نسوية مصرية صديقة من ضمن مؤسسي حزب العيش والحرية، وأيضا قامت بترجمة بمساهمة في ترجمة الدراستين على الأقل من الدراسات الموجودة هنا. إلهام، تفضلي.
مساء الخير عليكم جميعا، وأدي فرصة للترجمة. مساء الخير عليكم جميعا، وبشكركم على إتاحة الفرصة، وقراءة أصلا التقارير بالنسبة لي كانت مفيدة جدا يعني قبل ترجمتها. أنا عندي اقتراح، أو مش اقتراح، فكرة بشاركها معكم. إنه أنا بقيت حاسة كناشطة نسوية مهتمة بقضية العدالة الاجتماعية بسبب خلفيتي اليسارية والنسوية أيضا، إنه بتعرض لنقاشات وتحليلات كتيرة في المجموعات النسوية اللي أنا جزء منها لتحليل مدى أبوية النظام الاقتصادي القائم. لكن اللي بنسميه البوليسي alternatives أو السياسات البديلة اللي نقدر نطرحها كمجموعات سياسية على مستوى البلدان المختلفة، على مستوى البلدان المختلفة ضعيف شوية. ده بشوفه مثلا لما بشارك في صياغة برامج لمرشحين برلمانيين لحزب يساري ناشئ زي اللي أنا فيه، زي في إيفنت. بمعنى مثلا هديكم مثال، إحنا كنسويات فاهمين مسألة العمل غير مدفوع الأجر، مساهمة غير مدفوعة الأجر في الاقتصاد سواء داخل الأسرة أو خارج الأسرة، وفاهمينها كإشكالية نسوية كبيرة، إن الاقتصاد السائد المينستريم ايكونومكس بيحرم النساء، بيمنع تقدير هذا النوع من العمل الرعائي بالذات غير مدفوع الأجر. علشان أنا أطرح بقى، فأنا بقول ده كفكرة نظرية وبؤمن بيها كواحدة نسوية، لكن وأنا بشتغل فيها يعني محتاجة أشتغل عليها على مستوى السياسات. ده هينعكس إزاي؟ ينعكس في سياسات تأمينات اجتماعية من نوع مختلف، لأنه التأمينات الاجتماعية في بلد زي مصر اللي أنا منها منحازة أو بايزد للعاملين بأجر، وما بتشوفش، والعاملين بأجر في القطاع المنظم ما بتشوفش خالص العاملين غير اللي في القطاع غير المنظم والعاملين مش بأجر أصلا في السوق، يعني كثير من النساء. فيعني باختصار أنا محتاجة ننقل نقلة شوية على موضوع البدائل السياسات على المستويات المحلية. طبعا أنظمة التأمينات الاجتماعية والضمان الاجتماعي بتفرق من بلد لبلد، بس في يعني ممكن نبذل مجهود إن احنا نقدم نترجم أنظمة ضمان اجتماعي بين قوسين نموذجية أو أقرب للمفهوم النسوي، ونطرحها في البلاد اللي فيها انحياز أبوي في الأنظمة دي. يعني النقلة من الكلام النظري حوالين عدم تقدير أو عدم حسبان العمل غير مدفوع الأجر ليه انعكاسه في السياسات. يعني انعكس إزاي؟ أنا متصورة إن انعكاسه في أنظمة الضمان الاجتماعي. نفس المسألة في موضوع الضرائب. احنا فاهمين ان الضرائب منحازة، لكن أنظمة الضرائب يعني محتاجة أطرح يعني أنا آسفة أنا قطلت، بس مثلا في موضوع العمالة المرنة، أنظمة العمل المرنة اللي ستات كتير أنا واحدة منهم بتشتغل فيها دلوقتي as freelancers أو غيره. أنظمة بقى الضرايب اللي بتنظمها، بنكتشف في الممارسة إنها بتأذي الستات جدا باعتبارهم من الفئات يعني باختصار عايزين نساعد بعض شوية في إن إحنا بالذات من الدول النامية أو من دول الجنوب نشوف نماذج تشريعات وأنظمة في القضايا الاقتصادية نقدمها كبدائل، وإحنا بنتعارك وإحنا بنتخانق على المفاهيم دي، سواء مع صناع القرار في الدولة، سواء مع الآخرين من الرجال في تياراتنا برضو. شكرا، أسفة على الإطالة.
شكرا جدا الزميلة إلهام. وكما أشارت الزميلة بوميكا في التشات، يوجد أيضا مصدر للقراءة حوالين الفيسكال جاستس وبدائل Feminist Economics Alternative for Fiscal Justice. سنعمل مستقبلا أيضا على ترجمتها، ولكن نحتاج أيضا إلى إنتاج مصادر من المنطقة. أضم صوتي لصوتك، ولكن إجابة على سؤالك، يوجد قنوات للتغيير ويوجد قنوات للترافع، وخصوصا لمن يضعون هذه السياسات الغير نسوية والغير والتي ترسخ الانيكواليتيز وعدم اللامساواة في دولنا. وأتحدث هنا عن السياسات التي يعتمدها صندوق النقد الدولي والبنك الدولي، وسياسات الفيسكال والمونيتري الخاصة أيضا بالديون والتقشف. لأنه الوقت قد يداهمنا، فأنا محتاجة أعطي إذا لم يكن هناك تعليق آخر من القاعة، سأعطي الكلمة للمتحدثات استغلال الوقت في الختام بالكلمات. ولكن دعوني أيضا أبدأ بزميلتي كيتي من Gender Action Nexus من ويدو. كيتي، أريد أن أستمع إلى دقيقتين تعقيبا على ما تم ذكره، وثم أنتقل إلى ديانا ثم إلى بوميكا. كيتي.
Thanks so much, Shireen. This has been such a really interesting kind of beginning of a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing next steps and how we can work together, and really learning from colleagues in the MENA region about how this could hopefully, be of support to the work that you're doing. So I don't want to take up time. I'll just share that the Feminist Action Nexus is figuring out our work for the next couple of years. And as Shireen mentioned, hopefully that will involve a little bit of work on trade, which is an area we haven't done much on. But we really want to be responsive to the movement. So if you have ideas for resources or further translations or places where you'll be present doing advocacy, we would love to collaborate. There will be a virtual meeting in early April looking at the economic justice and climate finance linkages in particular. So we'll make sure everyone gets invited to that, and we'll have interpretation in multiple languages so we can really strategize together and look at the year ahead and opportunities to continually challenge the status quo and work together. So thank you so much. I'll pass to Diana.
Yeah, I think we are all in agreement with what Ilham was sharing earlier about how traditional economics is just wholly, unfit to really measure, acknowledge, redistribute the kind of unpaid care work that women have been carrying for centuries. And it will not, in the way the current economic system is designed, it will continue to do so unless we see really big, large systemic and structural transformation to the economic system, how it's from everything to how it's being taught in university, what's acceptable around it and what's not acceptable around it, to the point, even to the extent of how you know, a lot of economic policies and ideology are almost often always accepted as if they are sort of like set in stone or they're science that you cannot question, when in fact they're all ultimately just political, you know, projects or political identities or political dialogues and ideologies, which therefore means that it can all be questioned, it can all be unpacked, and the whole way of how we see, perceive, define economy can be wholly different than how it is commonly and widely currently is. And so, but I think, and also as Bhumika also shared in the resource, there is also no shortages of the amount of alternatives that both feminists and also other social movements in the global south are coming up, whether they're really, really big macro level sort of like alternatives to, you know, even like more micro specific within the larger global economic system, looking at trade, looking at tax, looking at debt, and, you know, and other different sphere of the economy, right? And so there is certainly no shortages of those really powerful, impactful alternatives that's being developed by feminists in the South and movements in the South. The problem is really for us trying to figure out how we can, you know, push this agenda at a much more global scale, and how do, I think in Bhumika mentioned it, de-link many of our states from in the South with the North, in how our economic system and trade policies and investment rules are being made. And I think like maybe kind of going back just a little bit in closing to Shree's earlier question, there has been, I think, over centuries, so many examples of when countries from the global South or countries from the third world would try and come together and form its own alternative, its own solution, its own sort of identity. And obviously, you know, we all have different relationships with our states. We all have different perception about our states and the role that they play. But obviously, we don't see this process, any kind of like process of democratizing our global economic system, to be separate from the process of democratizing our national governments and our national processes, right? And so we see those processes as together, you know, and we look back at, there's been so many examples of those kind of political projects in the South, in the third world. And then we learn from like what worked or what didn't work, or why some of those projects failed, even when they were potential for it, at least at the time when they came up. And then we look at some of the examples that have also come out from other Southern states in recent years, and why also some of that's failed. And I think there's probably something there that we can learn, or something that we can take in terms of trying to figure out how do we de-link that relationship, but also really strengthen that identity and that political relationship and that solidarity in the South, between movement, between issues, but also realistically between states, because we do need that as well, and how we can use that to counter a lot of the powers, the traditional colonial powers in the North. And I think there's probably a lot that's also being talked about that through cross-movement collaborations and cross-movement spaces. And I think that's also something that we can continue pursuing, and how we really strengthen that identity, because even in some recent instances where we see global South country, you know, trying to position things differently, you know, they're either, you know, being stopped at some point of time, or they faces a gate or other forms of backlog, or, you know, or they get directed to something that was completely different than perhaps what was originally intended. But there is something there for us to revisit what were some of the works that the people, the generation that came us had tried to do in the past, and how can we build that further in this current time and in this current context.
Thank you, Diana. Over to you, Bhumika. We have less than 2 minutes. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot has been said. I am in absolute, complete, 100% resonance with my dear sisters, Katie, Diana, and yourself, Shireen. One of the most affirming things is to see how we're really all resonating with each other. We have very much a unified vision and clear links between what we are all saying. I just, want to highlight again the core issue, at least what many of us feel is a core issue, is the continuity of external sovereign debt as the primary lever and tool of economic imperialism today. Debt has always been the colonial tool. It has always been the key lever of extraction, dependency, subordination, and compliance. And since the political independence of the third world in the 1950s, 40s, 60s, after that era of political independence, it was clear that debt was going to be enforced as the main, as the primary, systematic and almost automatic form of indirect colonization. So to start with, I think we must recognize that the forms, the methods, the techniques of colonial rule have shifted, but the logic has not. And it doesn't mean we need to categorize into a very simplistic binary of colonizer and colonized. We know that the nation state was also created by the political independence process as ensuring that the elites of the developing countries would remain in power and remain subservient to the interests of the former colonizers. So we know that it is not as simple as geography or skin color or race or ethnicity. We know that this is a logic of extraction and domination that is really based on power. And so I urge all of us to keep centering power relations at the core, and that when we talk about delinking, when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about strategies, we must center power relations at the core, because all of the economic structures are based on unequal power relations. Essentially, debt is a formulation of unequal power. Who owes whom? Who is in debt? What is the meaning of indebtedness? Without getting too philosophical, let me just say that the scale of extraction happening today via debt, the fact that an average 25% of the global South's public revenues is going into repaying the richest actors in the world, institutional lenders and creditors such as asset management funds and investment banks, primarily headquartered in New York, in London, in the financial centers and the tax havens of the world. And this is an extremely aggressive moment of colonization we are in. And what is aggressive about it is that it is happening in a very automatic way. It is not through, well, it is also through guns and weapons and battleships, but when it comes to debt, it is an almost automatic extraction that is baked in, that is rolled in to the system of the financial architecture. So I urge us, when we think about sovereignty, we think about what is making a country indebted. What is the making of the indebted state? The dollar hegemony, free capital flows, the fact that developing countries cannot protect themselves, the fact that the entire production structure is going into repaying debt, and the dependency on external financing. How was the South made dependent? And how can we then create this chain reaction, the way that biology creates, protein and amino acids and enzymes that act as catalysts? How can we catalyze a chain reaction for sovereignty on debt and economy, sovereignty on food, sovereignty on industrial policy? What kind of South-South solidarity will be required? What kind of strategies of economic independence will be required, and how none of it is going to be possible through the nation state. It will require movements and grassroots power to drive it forward. We cannot rely on the nation state. We have to figure out how to make the nation state responsive to movement power. So with that, I want to conclude, hopefully on a note of strength and hope and solidarity.
Thank you, Bhumika. And let me say a final word from my side, because I can see Sanam to have her now So I hope to have like a closing statement from her. But let me say for all our colleagues here, especially from the MENA region, خليني أقول لكل الزميلات والزملاء النسويين والنسويات وما بينهما أيضا أنه سنقوم قرأت تعليقك الزميل أحمد المقدم من مقدم من الحركة النسوية في تونس. سنقوم في MENAFem بعمل اجتماع تحليلي أو استراتيجي قبل الاجتماعات الصيف الخاصة بالبنك والصندوق في آخر شهر مارس. أدعوكم جميعا للتواصل معنا لمن أراد حضور هذا الاجتماع وإضافته أيضا إلى مجموعة العمل ومجموعة البريد. أرجو تواصلوا معنا لنستطيع جميعا مع وضع أيدينا على القضايا المهمة الخاصة بنا في هذه الحركة من المنطقة، وكيف ربطها بالنضالات على مستوى الجنوب العالمي والنضالات المشتركة مع الكونية. سأعطي الفلور لسنام، ولكن قبل أن أعطي الفلور لسنام أريد أن أشكر جميع الحضور والمتحدثات. أشكر زميلتي كيتي وزملائنا في Gender Action Nexus وويدو. أشكر أيضا المترجمات الموجودين هنا، وأيضا الزميلات والزملاء الذين ساهموا في ترجمة هذه الدراسات إلى العربية كالزميلة إرهام عيدروس. سنام, our last word and the floor is yours.
Always dangerous to give the last few moments, I think, because you feel like you want to respond to everything that's been said. So I'll just keep it to say that it's wonderful for us to be able to come back to these pieces that we worked on a few years back, because in rereading and preparing for today's launch of the Arabic materials, just realized how we've advanced the conversation in some of these issues greatly. And I've reflected on the fact that we think that these structures of power are so pervasive all around us that they are impossible to bring down. But collapse happens slowly and then all at once. And it's, my piece was specifically around corporate power and kind of the baseline of what we expect in engagement in multilateral spaces. I think since then we've had very strong conversations of what multilateralism should be. I think we've had kind of a veil been torn down in relation to the hypocrisy of who human rights and who development is supposed to be for, and what these structures of power that Bhumika has been sort of talking about and Diana has also outlined have been maintaining. But it is not to be forgotten that the reliance of the corporate form in maintaining all of these pieces is massive, and that's why we can never lose sight of the importance of building other forms of power. That's where movements come in. That's where different ways of working together, whether that's cooperatives, whether that's a different way of ownership, and for us to seriously think about the things that really are important to us, whether that's reparations, right? This is a conversation that I think in the 3 years since we wrote this piece, reparations, land back are real conversations, are real small initiatives that have been happening. And unfortunately, at the same time, we've seen some really destructive sort of ideas take force. For example, nuclear energy, something that we've been decrying day after day after day. But this tells us that, our power lies here very strongly in centering the narrative, and that people around the world are ready to accept our ideas and to accept our push for something different and something new, and for deconstruction of what has been hurting us for generations. So I really want to sort of welcome the possibilities as we engage more greatly with language justice and interactions and learning more from the regions and sub-regions, especially the Arab region that we're engaging with these materials today. It's really, really important for us to keep building our power and showing up for each other. So thank you so much.
Thank you سنام، وبشكر الحضور. كيتي لو عندك أي إضافة قبل ما نقفل. شكرا جزيلا. أشكر الحضور، أشكر زميلتي ماجدة من MENAFem، أشكر الجميع. قد كان نقاشا ثريا، وهو فقط بداية للهب اللي احنا بصدد تكوينه معا جميعا، بداية لفتح هذا النقاش مع الحركة العالمية والحركة من رفيقتنا في الجلوبال ساوث. ألقاكم قريبا. أيضا أخيرا ستجدون الدراسات على موقع Action Nexus، Gender Action Nexus on Climate Justice and Economical and Climate Justice، وأيضا موقع MENAFem. وسنتواصلوا معنا حتى نستطيع إضافتكم إلى الاجتماع القادم لMenafem Movement حوالين التخطيط الاستراتيجي. شكرا جميعا وإلى اللقاء.